Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is session 10 of MOOC 13. Back by popular demand, I have my eunuch hat on. I think I'm going to keep my eunuch hat on until the end of the COVID-19 crisis. It is, I think that's going to be the plan. So, I'm glad to see some people are now showing up on the live discussion and the chat. We've taught this course 13 times, 12 times before. And always to my surprise, I'm always surprised. I mean, I'm not surprised, but I am surprised. The lowest online attendance is for the regulatory course, because I think people hear regulatory and tax and rules and laws, and it sounds boring, intimidating, annoying. Who likes thinking about taxes? Most people don't. But I actually think this is one of the more interesting topic areas. And the reason it's interesting is because it helps highlight a lot of the dynamics, a lot of the parameters, a lot of what cryptocurrency is and isn't. Because it's one thing to look at it in abstract from a technology perspective and say, okay, yeah, it does this and it's a blockchain and we write blocks in the blockchain. And then when you have to think about regulatory and legal and tax items, it forces you to think how this matches or doesn't match with existing companies or processes or theories that we have in society already. And once you start doing that, you start picking up getting a sense, I think, of just how interesting, unusual, strange, innovative cryptocurrency is, because it really doesn't cleanly fit into anything else that pre-exists, right? Like I mentioned it in the presentation. I think we have a question about this, which I'll get to, but I do think it is a key thing to take away from today, which is this new technology innovation, a way of organizing people has emerged. And then because we still live in a society of humans who live in nation states and their physical bodies are in those nation states, for sure there will be laws and regulations that will apply. People may or may not like that, but it is for sure going to be the case. And once you start thinking about which ones may or may not apply, it gets very confusing and gets very interesting. And then you can get to some real deep philosophical discussions about what this actually is. I'm going to pause and ask a question of myself. From something I just mentioned, which is less so now, but in the early days of cryptocurrency, there was a lot of, well, code is law, and this is an international digital topic. And given this, I'm not sure that the laws are going to apply here. And here's where I have the advantage of just being old enough to have lived through the development of the consumer internet in the 90s. And I remember in the 90s that there was much the same thought, which is, okay, well, there's the physical world, and in the physical world, sure, of course, it makes sense. You can't go steal a car or punch someone in the face, and that's the world we know, and it has rules and laws and regulations, and of course we expect them, they're going to still be there. But now we have something new. It's networked, it's digital, it's a community, it crosses borders. It doesn't feel like anything else we're doing. And so there's just going to be the rules of cyberspace, and the rules of cyberspace aren't going to be the rules of nation states. And please leave us alone. And there's actually a quite famous essay on this topic. And fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your philosophical view, you can take it fortunately or unfortunately. We can now report that that definitively was not true. Right? That turns out that even if you do things on the internet, it does not mean you're not subject to laws. And it's funny because I'm sure most people today in 2020 consider that to be self-evident, kind of obvious. Like if you're Amazon and you're selling shampoo, or I guess hand sanitizer today over the internet, you're probably gonna have to pay taxes, right? Like that's if you engage in criminal activities and you use the internet to do them, you don't suddenly get some free pass. But like if something was a crime, if you picked up the phone and did it, and if instead you do it on a web server, probably doesn't stop being a crime. But that wasn't how people thought about it, or at least a community of people thought about it in the early days of the internet, that this was the chance to remake society. And the thought wasn't like, oh, fantastic, it was very well intentioned. It wasn't, let's go to the internet and on the internet we'll do crimes. Wasn't the thought. It was a more pure thought. It was a thought that says, oh, well, there's all types of negative things that happen in society. And then societal reactions like laws and police and courts and jails that are a counter-reaction to the negative things, but those are often also bad and sometimes corrupted themselves. And well, here we are in the internet, in this safe space. Maybe we can rebuild a better, more utopian world. And I regret to inform everyone that that particular thought process is not true. The internet is wonderful, and it has been an amazing net contributor to human welfare, knowledge, interconnection of humanity. But positive or negative things in how people interact with each other doesn't have to do so much with the technology, has much more to do with humans. And so if someone previously was doing crimes with a telephone, that same someone might enjoy doing crimes with a computer. And if someone is doing crimes with a computer, people who are in the law enforcement community aren't going to think to themselves, wow, what can we possibly do now? He's using a computer. Well, no, they're going to think we will persecute crimes that have to do with computers. And the same thing applies here, which is we should expect that, broadly speaking, societies will, broadly speaking, take the position that things that are allowed in the physical world will be allowed in the blockchain world. Things that are disallowed will be disallowed. And I'll put the asterisks, I'll come back to the asterisks. Things that are taxable will be taxable. Things that are not taxable will not be taxable. I think that is the general starting point of how the state will look at this. And it's hard to imagine why they would look at it differently than that, right? Like why, if some activity is taxable, if you did it without a blockchain, why should it be suddenly tax-free if you do it with a blockchain, right? Like it's a not normal thing for the state to think this topic. And so, and people say, well, but I'm not interested, and can they stop me? Well, I mean, yeah, they can. Right? Like, you yourself can't go live on a blockchain. Right? You are a physical human being, and you live in some nation state, and you're still bound by the rules of that nation state. And so long as we are in physical form and we live in a nation state, the weak point in the chain to any of these code is law and you can't stop me are us. Right? Someone can still come and arrest us. And so, and it's hard, and then people say, oh, but there's encryption and there's, I'm going to anonymize how I do things. And that's fine, it's true to some degree, but none of that's perfect. And then all you need to do is slip up once. Particularly with blockchains, right? It's a permanent record of what's happened. So one error along the way, and then the whole history of everything else will start coming to light for law enforcement. So I think the general expectation should be that the area is in fact already regulated, will continue to be regulated. People in the blockchain cryptocurrency community taking the position that, well, you can't regulate us, and no one on the other side is going to think this is a particularly good idea, and it'll just shut down conversation. And so what I think is a better model is to engage to ensure that to the degree that things are regulated, they're regulated in a manner that doesn't prevent us from picking up the benefits from this technology and doesn't have a negative impact on the innovation because the regulation's misguided, it's inappropriate, it has to do with different things that are not these things. And that's a real challenge, and we'll talk about some of the specifics, but it's difficult. And I speak from personal experience. There is an ad hoc committee in the government of Cyprus that is building the framework for blockchain legislation and cryptocurrency legislation in Cyprus, and I'm a member of that committee, and I have been for the last 2 years. And some things are pretty obvious what you can do, and some things are less obvious in what you can do, and some things, which I'll come to them during this discussion, you say, well, I think I know what you have to do to be intellectually consistent, but this will slow down some innovation. It will. It's inevitable. There's going to be more bureaucracy and paper filing than you would have liked in a perfect world. So I'll leave the general topic here and get to the questions, but I think this framework is how I'm thinking about things. So let me open up the questions. Okay. Is Bitcoin a platypus? Is the first question. Bitcoin and cryptocurrency is often seen as property, as a commodity, and as a currency. Isn't it really a category creator like the platypus animal? And if so, couldn't trying to cramp it into the current regulation and legislation hinder the development of its potential, at least for countries with a less flexible mindset? And Dimitris, I love Dimitris, this is amazing. He has given me a note here in case I wasn't sure what a platypus is. It's very helpful. I'm going to read it. It is perhaps the most bizarre creature on the planet. It is a venomous, egg-laying, duck-billed, beaver-tailed, otter-footed mammal. These things simply aren't supposed to go together. That's very good. Yeah, no, I agree with the question. Bitcoin is a platypus. And this is part of the difficulty in how you regulate it, because it looks like it's weird because like people like you see commentators like, oh, cryptocurrency is unregulated, we need to regulate it. In fact, it's kind of the opposite. Cryptocurrency has this characteristic that every regulator looks at it and says, oh, this is the thing I'm supposed to regulate. So, in the traditional world, you don't have any real confusion about if you are a security or a commodity or a currency or just a piece of tangible property, and therefore who your regulator is. Because it's this platypus, the commodities regulators look at it and say, oh, I need to regulate this. And the securities regulators say, oh, I need to regulate this. And then the tax guys say, oh, I need to regulate this, and so on. And the money transmitting guys, FinCEN, says, oh, well, no, this looks like a remittance firm. I need to regulate this. And so you have everyone coming in and getting involved. So this is true. What do you do about it? And I think what people have done about it, in the case of Bitcoin specifically, is they have, without saying this is what they're doing, they have adapted around it without actually saying they're adapting around it. So what do I mean by that? Let's talk about some of the examples that were in the presentation. And I'm sorry this one was late again, and some of you might have not had a chance to look at it. But two areas that I think are very relevant to this question when it comes to Bitcoin. In the presentation, we discussed money service businesses. Money service business are things like money transmitters, Western Union, check cashing firms, etc. They are regulated with the same anti-money laundering rules as banks, so that people don't use them to money launder as an alternative to banks, right? Like, it's not rocket science. And they have, FinCEN has come and said, if you are Coinbase, you're an exchange, and you put in dollars on the one hand and take out Bitcoins on the other, or dollars on the other, and you can send them to different people or bank accounts or what have you, well, you need to file these same reports. You, Coinbase, needs to file the same suspicious activity reports that they would if they were a bank. And so if you see Antonis A.Polemitis putting in $100,000 and then sending it to some sketchy place, some sketchy bank in some sketchy place that looks suspicious to the United States of America for good or bad reasons, well, that's going to get reported. And I think in the spirit of consistency, it's logical that it's going to get reported. But notice what I just said. It's Coinbase that's doing the reporting. It's not Bitcoin, right? So it is actually hard to regulate the Bitcoin network. Who exactly are you going to regulate? Who are you going to send the letter saying, Dear CEO of Bitcoin, can you please inform us if you see any suspicious transactions on the Bitcoin network? They know there's no one there that they can call. And so they've taken a very sensible position that a consumer transacting on the Bitcoin network directly is not a money service business. Nobody has to report. But if you're running a business on top of it, then you have the same requirements as a bank. And I think that's fine, actually. And I think that gets you 90% of the way anyway, because most people are going to go through an exchange to buy or sell cryptocurrency. The likelihood you're going to buy and sell your cryptocurrency by meeting some guy in cash on a corner to give them cryptocurrency, and you give them cash and they give you cryptocurrency. I mean, sure, someone's going to do it, but it's a lot of work. It exposes you to other risks. And the state, for better or for worse, but in the state's job, they're trying to control these types of things, right? Gets most of what it needs by doing that. It's always a trade-off. Like there's no, cash is still the best way to money launder, and we still have cash. They haven't banned cash. They would like to, but they haven't, because there's other trade-offs. Like you could eliminate speeding by banning cars. Well, there's trade-offs. Cars are useful. Speeding is bad, but cars are good. So all societies have to make these trade-offs on where they draw the line between perfect enforcement of against an undesirable behavior and, well, practicality. So the line was drawn with Bitcoin that says, practically speaking, it's not easy to regulate the network. I mean, you could, right? You could like trace every single person who connects to the network and like show up at their house and say, Dimitri, why did you send 10 Bitcoins to someone else? But it's not very practical. It's difficult. And so they said the people with a reporting requirement are the exchanges, which is where most of the transaction volume is going to happen. And they get most of the way there. Same thing applies on securities legislation. Again, I know you didn't have much time to look at it, but we have the Howey test. It determines in the United States what is a security or not. Well, strictly speaking, that's not exactly right. I'm going to say it correctly. It determines what contracts are investment contracts, and investment contracts are a form of security. So if a contract is an investment contract and therefore it's a form of security, then securities legislation applies. And the SEC, who is the relevant regulator, looked at Bitcoin and said, hey, guess what? This is not a security. I think that's right, in that who's the third party you're relying on? What is the common enterprise you're relying on? It's not clear that there is someone. But whether or not that is, strictly speaking, theoretically correct, it is also practically correct. Because if you had concluded that Bitcoin was a security, you would then have to further conclude that someone has done an unregistered securities issuance, and that person is Satoshi Nakamoto, and now you have to find him. And then everyone else who has bought or sold Bitcoin is actually selling an unregistered security, and they might also have liability, and now you'll have like millions of people that are guilty of securities violations when they're just just random human beings. And so the practically correct answer is to decide that Bitcoin is not a security. I think it's not also substantively, but it kind of doesn't matter, because practically that's the right answer. Where you see this more is in the case of Ethereum. Ethereum at launch looked quite a bit like the other ICOs that have been classified now as securities tokens, and therefore subject to securities legislation. Ethereum is also very widespread, traded in a lot of places, held by a lot of individuals. And the SEC was thinking about what to do with Ethereum. The European Union said, we're just going to treat it as it's a payment token also. And they kind of lobbied the SEC to do the same thing. And the SEC eventually found this two-step approach. That they said, well, it probably was a security token at launch, but we have concluded that over time, certain instruments, certain tokens can change form. Because it was a security token at the beginning, it was pretty centralized. If we don't say that, then none of the other ICOs are going to look like security tokens. But now, today, it has sufficiently decentralized that there's not really a common enterprise, so it's now not a security token, so we don't have to do anything. This is the cleanest example of something that says, whatever the grand theory is, there is also a political, practical aspect that says, it will be an endless nightmare for the SEC and for many people if you conclude that today Ethereum is an unregistered security being transferred around the world. So let us find a way to conclude that it is not. So Bitcoin is a cleaner story. Ethereum, probably you can make the case that it's not a security, but like Ethereum today, starting off today as Ethereum did, probably wouldn't make the cut. So Ethereum managed, I think, to get grandfathered in a way. And I think most ICOs, as they come up now, it's going to be hard unless you do a bunch of things that the average ICO promoter doesn't want to do, which is, don't tell people that, don't make it look like, you're selling stock of something that you own a lot of and you're going to pump the price because you're going to get rich, which is what most ICO people were doing. You have to go very much counter your monetary instincts. I think if you go very counter your monetary instincts, you could imagine a compliant kind of ICO done as an airdrop or something. You could do it. But you could do it at the cost of not necessarily making oodles of money, which was the driving force behind a lot of ICOs. So my view is, to a large degree, not perfectly, but to a large degree, without saying it's a platypus and we're going to have a special platypus legislation for Bitcoin, the regulators have indirectly recognized its platypus characteristics and taken decisions with that in mind. So, I think, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not sure, the same thing has happened with the platypus, right? It's somewhere on the family tree of animals, even though you could imagine it being at multiple different places. But like, you have the family tree, and so you got to put it somewhere. And there you go. I mean, it can't be in like 5 places in the family tree. And you're not going to have a different family tree for platypi, I think. So, all right, next questions. Do the strict rules of MSBs and New York BitLicense lead to companies taking business elsewhere where legislation may be less strict and more laissez-faire? Absolutely true in the case of BitLicense. There are many cryptocurrency firms that have taken the position that they are going to be available in 49 of the states of the United States of America and not in New York State. There are others that have said New York State is the financial capital of the world. We need to be there. We will take the additional compliance cost and energy to get a BitLicense. It is a business decision. It is a perfectly reasonable business decision, whichever one you take. And it's also a business decision by any particular geopolitical entity, state, country, etc., to say, I am going to be more flexible and take some more risk in order to attract more firms, or I am going to be more strict and I am going to set high standards so I can attract the high quality firms and eventually become the standard of quality. Which answer is right or wrong is unsolvable. There's no obviously right or wrong answer. It is a business decision. Of course, this leads to funny things, right? Because you'll see terms of use for certain firms that say, you can use our exchange unless you live in North Korea, Cuba, Syria, or the state of New York, right? Like all the countries that are sanctioned by the United States and the state of New York, where they're just trying to avoid the BitLicense legislation. Okay, well, let's say national currencies go digital. Wouldn't that benefit governments, i.e. automated tax transactions to tax authorities and less tax evasions? A lot of economies, from developed and underdeveloped, still have gray or underground areas where transactions are done by cash while out being registered or taxed. With transactions on the blockchain, would the governments receive more steady income through automatic taxation? So this is a good question. This would apply to CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. We've heard this a lot over the years of the opposite's going to happen. Like, not only we won't be tax-free on the blockchain, we're going to be higher tax on the blockchain because the governments are going to watch everything. I don't know. So there's still a huge number of transactions worldwide that happen in cash. And even though a lot of governments and central banks want to eliminate cash, nobody's managed to do it yet. Some of the Scandinavian countries are getting close, but nobody's managed to do it. eliminating cash has advantages and disadvantages. The advantages from a state perspective is that you'll get a better handle on tax evasion and anti-money laundering, and everyone always throws in terrorist financing, though. I mean, I don't know how often that's a real issue in most countries. I mean, we must be talking about a tenth of a tenth of a tenth of a percent of the population is running around doing terrorist financing in cash. But it sounds good, I think, to say that. On the other hand, so you reduce one type of risk, you increase a different type of risk. You increase the ability of the state to punish people who disagree with it. Because in addition to all the other, known punishments, you can kind of soft quarantine them from economic life if everything runs through a digital system. And so there's a trade-off. There's no correct answer about how much economic freedom one should have, but the price of better compliance with everything else is this price, that you do give the state more power to punish people who disagree with it, which may or may not be a good thing. Now, so in that context, I think people will launch CBDCs. I think they'll make a lot of sense for a lot of countries. But how that converts to automatic tax collection, I think is very difficult, actually. Because which transactions are taxable or not taxable is determined by an awful lot of things. So, I mean, like, people think of this presumably or generally in a sales tax, VAT tax type of context. And sure, in that case, if you're a restaurant and you accept credit cards, your ability to evade, I mean, not use restaurants because sometimes they're not taxed. Let's say you're a retailer and you're selling basketballs, and basketballs have an 8% sales tax. Your ability to evade sales tax is for sure higher if you're being paid in cash than if you're being paid by credit cards. I mean, you don't even need a CBDC to do this. You just need some auditable record of how much people have paid you over that time period, that the government can confirm your figures. So if you say, I sold $1 million in basketballs, and Visa shows that they paid you $2 million worth of consumer payments during that year, you might have some explaining to do that you wouldn't quite have if you had a cash-based approach. But more broadly, if you're just a general digital currency, you did all your transactions in a digital currency, whether or not a certain transaction is a taxable transaction, and if you should collect tax on it, very complicated question, right? Like, you're running an enterprise, you might do thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of transactions over the course of the year, and then whether or not you owe income tax then has to do with hundreds of factors about the cumulative impact of those transactions. So I think a world where the government is minute by minute collecting the tax for that minute, we're a long way away from the technology being able to support that, right? Like, is it conceptually, theoretically possible? I suppose. Suppose if you had daily financials of every business and a full understanding of how to classify every transaction, and based on the daily profitability of each business or individual or income, you say, oh great, Antonis, you made $132 today, I'm going to take 20. And oh, tomorrow you lost $100, I'm going to give you back 18, or what have you. I believe it is conceptually possible and practically a long way away. I don't know how to implement that system yet today. Okay, we have a long question. Over the years that I have been involved in the crypto space, I have seen many advocates of open decentralized technologies praise Bitcoin as an alternative to the established economic regime, a means for people to voice their opposition to harmful economic practices, like the infinite money printing we're now experiencing, the haircuts, the bailouts for multi-billion corporations and the banks, and when all else fails, even a last resort and a way out from a collapsing economy. At the same time, these advocates go above and beyond to reassure the public that they're paying their cryptocurrency taxation down to the last cent. I understand the importance of taxes, and I'm pro-taxes myself. I also understand that publicly admitting tax evasion would have major legal implications. True. But doesn't paying taxes imposed by a sovereign state on crypto seem contradictory to the ethos of an open, decentralized system evangelist? Shouldn't these advocates strive for a regulation-free Bitcoin and, instead of paying taxes in a centralized manner, work an alternative model that incorporates taxation and Bitcoin protocol where it could be handled in a transparent, open, and decentralized manner? Even if regulators don't like/agree with this model, then tough luck, we have ways to make crypto transactions untraceable. Aha. Good question. I think this question is mixing two different theories. There are people that like Bitcoin primarily as an alternative to state-issued money, not because they want the imminent destruction of the state, but because they consider that the state is going to devalue currency and they want an inflation hedge. I think a lot of these people 40 years ago, 30 years ago might like to buy gold, for example. There's another type of this person who doesn't actually identify as this type of person, who thinks gold is silly, those Warren Buffett types that say, like, yeah, well, the best inflation hedge is to buy stocks because they tend to go up in time at a much higher rate than inflation, right? Because you're buying productive capacity. So I think there's nothing inconsistent in saying, I think the investment performance of Bitcoin relative to dollars, stocks, gold, platinum, whatever, is going to be better. That's why I want to have it. I'm opposed to large bailouts of corporations for a variety of ideological reasons, and I don't mean that in the bad way. Like, I might think that it's better that the free market has more ups and downs, whatever the case may be. You can believe all of these things and still think that you should pay your taxes without anything being in the least bit contradictory. Now, there's a more extreme version of this that says, well, the reason I don't want government to be able to print money, etc., is they use this to fund wars and illegitimate government activities, and if we could starve them of this power, the world would be a safer, more peaceable place. Okay, I mean, I think that's a harder pathway to imagine getting accomplished, but let's say you believe that. You could still, theoretically, imagine you believe that and you want that, and if people start picking Bitcoin as reserve currency as opposed to US dollars, the power of the state to issue money and conduct wars will be reduced. And in the meantime, while this is all happening, and this might take a while, you would prefer to be out doing Bitcoin advocacy and not be in jail for tax evasion. Right? So I still don't think those two are inconsistent. The third bucket, what is mentioned there, is like, well, we're just going to decide how we're going to have taxation on the blockchain and tell the state, well, tough luck, you're going to do it our way, or we're going to make it untraceable or what have you. I don't think that will work well. I don't think the state likes hearing that as a first approximation. And so anyone who tells them that is going to get audited, I think. I mean, right? Like, I don't think that's going to work super well. But also, I'm not convinced how untraceable cryptocurrency can be, not for any technical reasons, but for practical reasons. Let's say someone just gifted me $1 million of Bitcoin in a completely anonymous manner. Satoshi wakes up says, I think Antonis is a good dude. Here's $1 million. Now I have $1 million of Bitcoin. Nobody knows how I got them. No one knows where I got them from. Nobody even knows my address. As anonymous. I'm the only person who knows that I'm $1 million richer in Bitcoins. Cool. For the time being, I am outside the purview of the state. So long as I am looking at my Bitcoins on the blockchain, you're right, they're sort of untraceable. Okay, now what? I looked at them, they're nice. I look at them tomorrow, they're still nice. If I just want to keep looking at them, this is okay, this works. But, you know, I'm in Cyprus, the sun is shining. I mean, not today, it's not, but the summer's shining. I want to go on the beach. I want to stay at a hotel. Oh, I need to pay the hotel. When I go check in at the hotel, I say, who are you? You're Antonis A.Polemitis. And can I have a scan of your passport? Sure. And I'm going to pay you with some of my secret Bitcoins. And let's say the hotel accepts Bitcoins. Probably doesn't, but let's say it does. Oh, okay, now we have linked my Bitcoins to me, and I've had a realization, and I'm going to buy a boat. I'm going to cruise around on my boat. Can I really buy $100,000 little speedboat with a tenth of my happy gifts, and the person who is selling me the boat not know who I am? Not easily. A house, cash. I want to take it to cash. Cash is untraceable. Well, either I need to send the Bitcoins to an exchange, or, and this is a much harder problem than it sounds, right? Like, let's say I said, no, I'm not going to go to an exchange. I'm an advanced user. I'm bold and daring. I want to turn $1 million worth of Bitcoin into $1 million worth of cash and not leave any trace of me doing that. That's not easy, right? It's not hard. It's not easy. Like, the number of people I could speak to confidentially and have a little bit of faith that it's a confidential in-person discussion, I haven't left a trace, and also who want to give me $1 million in cash because they have $1 million in cash lying around that they don't have to explain to someone why they have $1 million in cash lying around, and they're going to give me the cash in order to get the Bitcoin. And now they have the problem that I had, because if they show up with the Bitcoins, someone's going to ask them, where did you get them from? And I'm, I think, pretty sophisticated in my understanding of Bitcoin. The number of people I know who fit that category is zero. Like, if I had some like compelling reason why I needed $5,000 in cash, and I was going to transfer some like semi-anonymous Bitcoins to get it, could I probably find a buddy to like help me out? I mean, sure, probably. I'm not suggesting I would do that, but it's conceivable. If I had to do this for $1 million, no, it's impossible. I think it's actually impossible. And so, you know, the types of people that know the types of people that have $1 million in cash lying around that they'd like to swap out for Bitcoins are the types of people who are already in the business of hiding their economic activities from the state. For whatever reason they're doing that, right? Like, it's not. And so, practically speaking, I think while one can lobby for a different economic system, one can lobby for Bitcoin to be successful, one can lobby for changes in government policy. I think it is perfectly sensible that while one's lobbying that, one would prefer not to get fined or pay fines or go to jail or what have you, the negative tax evasion type things. And I think the ability to have a leverage against the state in this manner is low. I actually don't think you can do it at any reasonable scale as we are now. And so I don't think the kind of threatening the state back, well, if you don't do it my way, I'm just going to buy my cars, boats, groceries, school tuition, whatever, anonymously. I don't think that's actually that plausible. But it's a very good question, because this comes up a lot. Okay. I am very glad that someone has asked a question about the Howey test, because I wanted to talk about it. Regarding U.S. as a general rule, I read that the IRS is to treat VC, virtual currency, or cryptocurrencies as property assets like bonds, stocks, real estate, etc., with all the consequences like capital gains. In Italy, we also have property tax, i.e. real estate tax, just because it's in your property. I further read that ICOs, STOs, IO fall directly in the first bit of the Howey test because it's a transfer of money for the digital asset, regardless if the transfer is made by fiat money, cryptos, or others. So if I buy tokens from an ICO with cryptos, those cryptos are considered money. But before they were considered assets, property. However you turn it, it seems that Benjamin Franklin was an optimist. Yeah, no, I mean, look, it's a little bit of the platypus. It's a little bit of every regulator seeing it the way they want to see it. But it's also not wrong, right? Like the point of the first test of the Howey test is, have you given value for this, right? Because why does securities legislation exist? It exists to protect the investor. So which is why if you wanted to do a compliant offering, if you just went and gave away an airdrop, depending on how the rest of the thing is structured, well, that's a step in the way to it being a compliant non-securities offering. Once you have asked someone to give you money, whether it's dollars, crypto, real estate, cars, goats, whatever, they've given you something of value for the purposes of the Howey test. The Howey test is not evaluating, is not classifying what has been given in exchange for the token for its own tax purposes, right? Because the SEC doesn't care about your tax bill. That's between you and the IRS. And whether you're going to pay taxes on selling crypto has to do with a whole variety of other things. How long you've held them, what price you bought them. It doesn't have to do with whether the SEC considers that you've given value for a token. So I think it is perfectly logical for them to say, like, well, if it's crypto, if you've used crypto to pay for your tokens, you have given value. It's like money. I mean, it's hard to say that, like, Bitcoin's not a valuable asset, right? You can go at any point in time in a fairly liquid market and convert it into dollars or euros or yen or what have you. So I think it's sensible from the SEC's perspective. And separately, the IRS is saying you will treat it, and it's interesting because you made the property tax point, it's not being treated like property. So if they're in the US, property tax isn't at the national level, it's at the local level. No, Bitcoin is not subject to property tax. So real property, land, buildings, etc., tends to have its own deviations from the normal model in taxation, sometimes favorable, sometimes not favorable, that have to do specifically with real property. So property taxes are a good example. Many jurisdictions charge you a percentage of the property's value every year as property tax. There's also positive deviations. In the United States, there's a 1031 exchange for real property that doesn't apply to everything, that says if you sell a house and within a short period of time buy another house, you can defer your capital gains because they don't want to penalize labor mobility, for example. So if you've moved jobs and you have a house and you're not reducing your exposure to houses, right? You're not saying, I'm leaving houses and going to cash. I just have a house in Virginia and now I'm moving to Nebraska, and I had a house in Virginia and I need a house in Nebraska because I need a roof over my head. So I've sold my house in Virginia and maybe I had some capital appreciation, and now I need to buy a house in Nebraska, but I need the money that I used to sell it to buy my house in Nebraska. The US government says, no problem. You can roll that over and I'll tax you when you're done buying and selling some more houses. So there are always nuances, and when they say property, they don't mean real property. But the general treatment is, at the high level classification, are your gains from cryptocurrencies, and most, there's always an asterisk, developed countries treat it as ordinary income, salary type income, or capital gains, the gains you get from buying something at a lower price and selling it at a higher price. It's the latter, and that tends to be, in most countries, more favorable because the charges for the tax rates on capital gains tend to be lower than on salary income for a variety of reasons that are beyond the scope of today's discussion. All right, next question, last question, and because I have another call at 6, I'm going to answer this one and then I'm going to have to hop. What if a company was pre-funded, had working products ready, and did an ICO, STO, whatever? Would that still be considered fundraising for prong 1, since there is investment of money? Probably yes. On the other hand, Ethereum did a fundraising, but is now, if I'm correct, not considered a security since it developed into a platform. Doesn't strict application of rules not hinder future technological development? Yeah, so the answer to this is you're correct. It doesn't matter if the company's pre-funded. It doesn't matter if it has a working product. Just ask yourself if it was a regular company, right? If I had a regular company and I made the world's best cheese slicer, it's working, I have a product, and now I'm selling you shares in my cheese slicer company. Or a special investment contract where you make money every time I sell a cheese slicer, or a special contract that you get paid based on my annual profitability, and so on and so forth. Depending on the details, most of those would end up being subject to securities legislation. The same thing would apply here. The fact that you have a working product is not in and of itself a sufficient escape from the Howey test. Ethereum's a special case. As I mentioned earlier, Ethereum, if the securities enforcement that existed today existed back then, would, I think, been treated as a securities offering. And the fudge that they did is say, like, well, it probably was back then in 2014, but today it's sufficiently decentralized. They're not saying whether you paid money for it. You did pay money for it. It's sufficiently decentralized. There's not a common enterprise. So it's probably not a security now. And so this, you're actually saying, doesn't the strict rule hinder innovation? Like what you're asking, in effect, is wouldn't have it hindered Ethereum if Ethereum came today? And the answer is yes, it would have. And this is a very difficult one because I do believe ICOs have brought a very interesting fundraising model to the world. Super interesting. The ability from people around the world to send arbitrary amounts of money to a team to do something instantaneously is amazing, right? Like nothing like that existed before. So that's the good. I also simultaneously believe that what the world at large did with this innovation, on the whole, 8 or 9 times out of 10, was effectively mislead on purpose or through naivete a bunch of investors and took all their money. Like it was exactly the worst case scenario that securities regulators will come and say, this, what you guys did with ICOs in 2017, 2018, is exactly why we have securities legislation, so you don't rip people off, right? Like this is the, and so how you balance those two things is a very difficult question. There's no obvious answer. If you put a gun to my head and said, what would I do? You might sandbox it. You might say, up to a certain amount, you can do it with a very much lighter amount of regulation. So you allow some teams to try some things and be innovative, but you have gradations of protections that you don't have someone running a scam on purpose or by mistake. It could be that you're naive about what your product can do, and you end up taking $500 million of people's money before we realize this was a bad idea. So if you said, by a sandbox, sure, if you're raising less than 2 million, the set of rules you need to follow is much simpler. If you're raising more, you need to go through a more involved process. Might be a way to allow some innovation, and while still protecting the investor. And it's tough. Like this is, it's like many things in life. There are trade-offs. I would like to eat pizza and I would like to not have a belly, and there's actually no answer where I can have both, right? And so, and this is one of those. One would like innovation. One would also like people not to take people's money for scammy ideas. And there's no answer yet where you can get both those things perfectly. And so you kind of find solutions that are in the middle and balance the two pluses and minuses. So thank you, everyone. You guys were a very good group today, even though it was a little bit smaller. They were very good questions. I have to hop off. I will see you again next week. And thank you always for participating. And since I think more or less the whole world is in the same mode, please stay home and stay safe if that is at all possible for you to do. And hopefully in the next few weeks and months we will make progress against COVID. All right. Thank you, everyone.